Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Maggie Ryden, and as the Executive Director of the DC Alliance of Youth Advocates, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our first DCAYA Dialogue, Building Systems of Reconnection. As a coalition of over 130 youth-serving organizations that's focused on equipping DC youth with the resources they need to make the successful transition to stable adulthood, we spend a lot of time and energy focused on the needs and opportunities for educational and workforce success. Through the support of our co-sponsor, the Community Foundation of the National Capital Region, we're thrilled to be joined by three leading experts in strategies to reconnect disconnected or opportunity youth, to have a frank conversation about the evolution in this field nationally, examine and explore how DC is tackling the issue here, and discuss what we can learn from the innovation of others moving ahead. A few words on structure. While the first portion of this conversation will be largely moderated, we do have a fantastic set of viewers, and we are confident that you'll have some insightful questions and comments. So we encourage you to please put those into the box, and as able, we'll be responding to them in real time. We have left some time at the end to address any questions we're not able to get to throughout the course of this initial conversation. Finally, if you enjoy the event, we encourage you to consider donating to DCAYA and supporting our capacity to host events like this, both virtual and in person, in the future. I'd like to open by introducing our panelists. First, we have Robert Sains, an Assistant General Manager of Los Angeles' Economic and Workforce Development Department. In that role, Robert has implemented innovative approaches to align LA's re-engagement efforts with the complex workforce development system by co-locating academic advising, employment and training programs, and other supportive services at LA's 16 youth source centers. Re-engagement partners are able to tailor services to the varied needs of their disconnected youth. Next, we have Celine Faharan. Celine is the Senior Policy Advisor at the district's Office of the Deputy Mayor for Education. And in that role, she's spearheaded the Mayor's Raise DC Disconnected Youth Change Network, a diverse coalition of youth development experts, youth workforce experts, and educational experts, really focused on developing and assessing the district's re-engagement strategy. As a facilitator of the Disconnected Youth Change Network, Celine has truly been critical in the creation of DC's re-engagement strategy and soon-to-be center. Last, and certainly not least, we have Andy Moore. Andy is a senior fellow at the Institute for Youth Education and Families at the National League of Cities. In this role, Andy has been instrumental in helping DC to develop a full and robust re-engagement strategy, sharing his expertise, insights, and knowledge of the field nationally. Andy's worked extensively consulting on re-engagement efforts in Chicago, Philadelphia, and Boston, and he joins us today to provide, again, that national context and insight in how other communities have tackled and developed their re-engagement systems. As I said, we'll start the conversation with some fairly concrete questions, and I'd like to open with Andy. Andy, if you could provide us a bit of history on the evolution of and sort of birth of re-engagement centers in other communities, and sort of the rationale behind their development and what you've seen trend as communities have gotten multiple systems or centers up and running.
Good, thanks, Maggie, and want to commend DCAYA and the Foundation for hosting today's dialogue and for your leadership along with DC government and others in working toward the establishment of a re-engagement center in the district for the opportunity youth there. What this represents, what we call the re-engagement network, is a recognition in a growing number of cities around the country that there is a group of young people who, under normal circumstances, are out of school, usually out of work, and will not be able to progress toward a high school or post-secondary credential without some routing assistance and support. It's an extension of the ongoing discussion that we've had the past 15, 20 years in this country about the need for youth development services and supports across the board, and it applies that youth development approach for older youth. It also picks up on the opportunity to offer kind of one-stop services, either in a physical way or a virtual way, that makes it really easy for young people to establish a working relationship with a caring adult who will then serve as a guide for them back into education and beyond, and maybe to other things. So we started noticing this phenomenon, that people occupying this niche of education re-engagement in just a few cities around the country, cities such as Dayton, Ohio, Boston, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And thanks to ongoing visits sponsored by foundations and nonprofit organizations, the word began to get out, and Omaha was inspired to launch a re-engagement center. Robert, sitting over in Los Angeles, paying attention to what was going on in other cities around the country, figured out how to apply other cities' practices locally. The sites that are funded with federal money through some Department of Education source called the High School Graduation Initiative received encouragement to devote some of those federal grant funds to re-engagement as well as dropout prevention, which was their first purpose. And that has led to an upswelling of re-engagement activities. So the network has been growing organically so far. I think some of the recent and more innovations and more sophisticated developments have involved what you'll hear about from Los Angeles and the planning that has been going on in Washington, D.C., that really, at a very early stage, ask key questions that relate to the sustainability and permanence of a re-engagement effort. How can you embed it in existing government functions, or how can you embrace the activities and skills and capacity of the nonprofit community to contribute to ongoing re-engagement efforts. Other innovations around the country that have been especially important have been figuring out ways, locality by locality, to get a better kind of data sharing relationship going with the local school district or whoever holds the information about who has left school recently, so that there's a defined pool that people are working to re-engage. And there are other innovations as well that we can talk about in the course of today's call, but those are a couple of things I'd want to map out here early on. Really, the sky's the limit for re-engagement as we consider, the big problem of 6 million young people in the opportunity youth category nationwide, many of whom have no high school diploma, and the need for far more assiduous re-engagement efforts in every community around the country.
So thank you, Andy, and that's a perfect segue. I'd like to turn it over to Celine and sort of let's drill down a bit. Celine, can you talk about or pick up on some of the things that Andy just mentioned in terms of sustainability and how to get the right partners at the table and data sharing, and describe where the district is headed at this point in our first iteration of a re-engagement center and strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try to hit those, and if I stray away, gently guide me back. I think the big piece is really planting enough champions at different levels of government, but also having some key external champions who are willing to kind of jump into the water with you. I think we have been fortunate enough in DC to have a mayor who has led an organization that worked with this population, to having 2 deputy mayors, one for education and health and human services, who recognize the mutual dependency that they have upon one another, and that this population is one of those populations where that crosswork has to happen. And then being wrapped around with Raise DC, which is our city's Cradle to Career partnership. Many of you might be familiar with Strive. There's other cities that are doing this type of collaborative work, but Raise DC is our version. And being able to, as you mentioned earlier, Maggie, have a wide breadth of advocates, of education leaders, of school leaders, of nonprofits, of funders, of businesses sitting at the table and elevating reconnection as being one of the 5. And if there's only 5 and this is one of them, that's a pretty bold statement. So being able to kind of have the breadth and depth of people who say, yes, this is a priority is one thing. And then having someone who's willing to step out and be a leader and actually saying, okay, we're going to go from talking about an idea to actually figuring out what it is that we have to do, and then how do we marshal resources and the will from all the various partners who need to be in place to make it work. How do we do that? So the Deputy Mayor's office, we've been really fortunate. Our office has said, you know, this is something that we're going to put as one of our office's priorities. So it's not only a community priority, it's our office priority. One of the first things we did was we linked up with National League of Cities and we said, look, there is work that's happening. We need to plug in. We need to plug in fast, and we need to learn what other people are learning, and we need to be really clear about what our starting point is. And the Re-Engagement Center is an exciting piece. It's so needed. It's going to fill a big gap in our city, but it is literally a starting place. We see it as actually being a pretty specific linchpin in a big ecosystem, or a pinwheel of work that needs to also happen. And those are things we're learning from other communities too. Like, how do we simultaneously build a continuum of supports? You know, if you think about the vision of what ultimately DC needs, it's the continuum of engagement, and the Re-Engagement Center is simply one piece of it. It's a concrete and it's a necessary piece, and it's a momentum building piece, but it is literally one piece. So I'm happy to talk more about sort of what that work looks like, but I also want to emphasize that it is one piece of a larger ecosystem of work that is underway here.
So before I turn over to Robert, building on that, Celine, could you describe a little bit, well, let me step back. There was a very intentional decision here in the district to start our re-engagement focus very concretely on the education reconnection. Can you explain a little bit about the impetus there, just the rationale to starting with that one point as opposed to workforce and ed?
Yep, because you have to start somewhere. Because you have to start somewhere. I mean, that's the answer. I think Andy Andy and Robert, we kind of swirl around the same tables and we see each other repeatedly. But one thing that Andy had said at a previous engagement was like, you do something different and then you improve from there. And I think part of what we really had to get all of our supporters on the same page about is like, where is the intersection about the need that can be demonstrated by data? Where is the intersection between stuff that what can we ride on? Like, what's the momentum we can ride on? The pieces that are in place, and it's really the level of effort to bring them together. And I think you also then have to intersect that with, where is sort of common interest from all the different people who are at the table. And education, particularly non-graduates from high school, is a common denominator for everybody. And I think without that piece, Andy's point earlier, it's the workforce. The workforce piece doesn't make sense without it, right? Especially in the district, especially when we look at the competition in terms of residents who are coming from all over the country, where we are sandwiched between two of our highest performing education districts in the country. It is trying to figure out what is the baseline thing that young people need to have in order to really be able to take advantage of the opportunities with post-secondary, with work. And it's really just trying to get some consensus on that. So I get that it is, some people might say it's very narrow. It is intentionally narrow because we have to be really specific about where we start, but it's no way indicative of the fact that we think if we can just fix that one thing, then everything's going to be fixed. It's simply a starting place.
And I think also as a community, I would add to that, recognize that we had some great assets within our Office of the State Superintendent for Education in terms of understanding
absolutely
need. And it was definitely a logical and smart choice. But, Robert, when we look at Los Angeles, people get really excited because you've taken it a step further and really done a phenomenal job of blending in the workforce components. I'd love it if you could describe a bit about your system of connection opportunities and how you got to that place. Who was at the table to make those decisions? How have you been able to fund that kind of an initiative? Because it's a massive one.
So thank you for inviting me. And the work that we did here, and it was said earlier, it's really built on a lot of people's thoughts and ideas. Dr. Moore here, my good friend, has been really a thought leader in this for a very, very long time. But we had to start somewhere, and our starting somewhere was about getting the data. And in Los Angeles, we have approximately 500,000 young people ages 16 to 24. And when I asked folks, how many folks do you think are out of school? When we talk to young people that were working in the inner city, they will say 400,000. When you talk to seniors who are living on the west side, they'll say 10,000. And no one really had a good handle on what was the actual problem. So we actually had a study that was done by Paul Harrington, who is now at Drexel, but he was at Northeastern at the time. And the good professor from the East Coast came down to Los Angeles with no bones to crush and gave us some very objective data. Bottom line, he was able to see that about 92,000, so about 1 out of 5 of our young people ages 16 to 24 were out of school and out of work. And I stress that and out of work. And this was in about 8 years ago when the study was published, a little over 8 years ago. And at that time, I took it to the elected officials, the mayor at the time, city council members, school board members. And when I gave them that simple stat, they looked at me and said I was crazy. Maybe they didn't say it outright, so some of them did, but they really didn't believe the data. And we spent probably the next year to a year and a half of giving that data out. And our WIB and our youth council played a critical role in legitimizing what was really the true problem. When we were able to actually convince folks that we weren't making these numbers up, that we had a problem of the 100,000 young people out of school and out of work, it really gave us the real basis to call for action. And that call for action was taking our WIA youth dollars and using that as the basis to build a new system. An important thing that I always stress to folks is that you cannot program your way out of solving a 100,000 person problem. You have to develop a system, and the system around this problem, people are just amazed at that fact. But there's a real champion and my partner in the school district, Dr. Deborah Dorado, was actually just as concerned, if not more concerned about the issue, had the ability to direct resources within her school district. And really her and I and her team and my team sat around the table and said, let's vision this out. So we proposed a new RFP to our WIA board. And in that, we said we want to be all in. We put all of our $15 million of youth money into building the system and reprocuring it in a way that we emphasize out-of-school youth. So we're probably the first in the country that actually had 70%. We moved it from the 30% minimum to 70% of our funds were going to be spent on out-of-school youth. And we did take a lot of blows on that and pushback. But what we really were able to say to our leaders around the community is that there wasn't anybody really working with this out-of-school population. Here you had 100,000 young people who were being programmed to death, 100 folks here, 100 folks there. But the school district nor the city was really engaging them. I'll push forward. Once we were able to bring on our youth council, our WIB board, we brought our city council on board, and then we brought the school district. And we asked the school district to co-invest. Now, this was at a time when there was huge amounts of displacement and budget shortfalls in both entities. The school district was laying thousands of people off, and we were asking them to actually invest in this new system. We had champions out at the school board level that pushed it through. And at the end, we were able to put an RFP out that started with 13 centers. Each of the centers had a pupil service attendance worker who had access to the out-of-school youth data. Each of the centers are run by a community partner. We have 2 that are city staff and were legacies from the Youth Opportunity Movement who had a rich history in doing this work. So out of the 13 centers, we located them in the heart of the areas within our city that had the highest dropout rates. And that was critical as well. We were able to put these centers directly in the communities that we wanted to serve. So that's in Watts, that's in Borough Heights, that's in Pacoima. And we partnered, so our third partner after the school district was the community-based agencies. And we have a rich array of community-based agencies that actually do the work. We have our the LUSD co-located. And when we were able to open the doors, we were able to specifically focus on that out-of-school population coming back in. After a year of running and our first year data, we had over 8,000 young people walk through our doors. We had over 5,500 of them develop an educational plan. And with that educational plan, we were able to tell the young person how far they were from graduating, what they needed to do to get that high school diploma or GED, and what was their next steps. From that 5,500, we were able to enroll about 2,500 in our WIA program, another 1,000 plus in various city programs we had, another 1,000 in the workforce centers. We know we had 1,000 young people, or a little over 1,000 young people that were complete dropouts that we re-engaged back into school. And that was really about having a new vision and new commitments, and specifically developing a system targeted to this population. So now we're on our second year, or finishing up our second year of implementation, and we're going to meet equal numbers.
So I have a couple of questions building off that, and I'll open this up to the group. But something you said really stuck out to me in terms of leveraging the community-based organizations and partners to do the work. I think one of the things that we've struggled with here in the district is that recognition that what young people need, or the barriers to reconnection, often have less to do with school than they do family pressures. The need to quickly get a job and not necessarily go to school, or get the training for a livable wage job. And so how do we meet those wraparound needs that keep young people engaged?
So it's just the recognition. And again, you know, all of us...
I'd love to hear from Andy if he has thoughts on how this happened nationally, or how do you address that in LA?
So maybe I'll just jump right in. I think for us is recognizing each of these young people have a story and have a particular need. What we've tried to do in terms of our program is not to decouple education and workforce. Any of these young people that come in through our centers, they'll come in and say they want a job. But what we actually tell them, yes, we can find you a job, but you're going to have to do your part. And your part is getting your education, finishing your education. So we co-enroll the folks into a school program and into a workforce program. And by having that earn and learn concept, the work and education, it really is a benefit, and not to them, you know, immediately, because they're saying, well, why do I need to do this? But really painting that long-term picture.
Maggie, could you restate your question, and I'll take a run at it?
Oops, sorry, we're having some technical problems. Andy, do you want to say that again?
Could you restate your question, and I'll take a run at it?
Sure. It was just around how do we recognize and weave in the supports that youth need outside of just school and work to ensure they stay engaged in school and work. And Robert was saying, and I think that's a really fantastic point, Robert, that it's about not decoupling education and workforce, but seeing them as a joint effort and needing to do both, and recognizing that all young people have their own stories and their own discrete needs, and addressing it at an individual level, not necessarily a systems level. But we'd love to hear from you, Andy, if there are other communities that have really taken some strides or made some strides in that area.
Yeah. So let me start, Maggie, by saying we've come to talk about re-engagement centers or re-engagement programs as offering kind of 5 core functions, and there's some variation in the way that particular cities organize these functions, but it involves this kind of affirmative outreach to a known pool of dropouts, assessment of educational and psychosocial and other kinds of needs, referrals to alternative education, a way to complete their education, as well as referrals to other kinds of supports and services. Ongoing, support to re-enroll. The fourth is support to re-enroll, because the referral alone is rarely sufficient to bring about re-enrollment. And then support for at least the first year after re-enrollment in a new or alternative school setting. So, and undergirding all this is that youth development, caring adult kind of relationship that you want to establish as early as possible in the process. So, a strong re-engagement center would have, close to the phone or close to the computer, a list of resources to which it would refer young people who show up with particular support needs. And it would have, as it organized its staff, it would kind of constantly cultivate this sense of who can really provide high quality services for opportunity youth to meet their broader set of needs. And then when you've got these great examples like the one Robert's presenting, or what's being planned in DC, where you've got a down the hall or second floor option to go deeper, meeting a specific need, like the need for training for a job, et cetera, then that's even better. Just to make it as convenient as possible.
So
I would also just want to add, I think Robert made a really great point earlier, where he was talking about just sort of like really being able to start on a good set of data. And I think DC has been really fortunate in that there are actually multiple sets of data that we can stand on, and that I think is shaping how we are implementing our first re-engagement center. One is the Brookings Institute had come out with a few years ago, they laid the groundwork. They were the one who kind of cracked open this, number for out of school, out of work. And building on that, there are two additional studies. So one that DCAYA actually led, which was a Youth Voices survey. And I'll, Maggie, let you talk about that a little bit more. But it was really done in partnership with the Community Foundation, but it was really supported by our Disconnected Youth, or our Reconnecting Youth Network through Raise DC, who really did a lot of action research, where they helped refine the questions, they helped do the student focus groups, they have distribute hundreds and hundreds of surveys. And that's giving us, from a youth perspective, a really good data set that's helping us think through co-located. Yes. Are you really not hearing me? Sorry.
I think you may just need to refresh. You are coming in and out, so I'll give you a second to do that.
Okay, that's fine. I need to read my instructions for how to read. Oh, okay. Is that better?
Yeah.
I'm hearing an echo.
Try and refresh. In the meantime, I'm going to kick it back to Robert for a second and ask, and Andy, two interconnected questions. One, all of this is predicated on the fact that we get young people in the front door, and outreach and identification, if you have a good data set, is important, but then practically, how do you develop those first points of contact, get young people into the door, and then how do you keep that relationship sustained? And I think Annie made a few great points about continued one-on-one connections and finding mentors. But I'd love to hear a little bit about how you guys do outreach out in LA.
Sure. So with our partnership with LAUSD, and also to honor the FERPA, the Federal Education Privacy Act, we don't have access to the data. And when I mean access to data, the access to the LAUSD dropout list. But LAUSD has access to its own list. So the counselors in each of the centers maintain that data. They do the initial outreach, and this is a very targeted, so you think about targeted marketing. They have a list of about 18,000 young people who should be in school who are not in school. So this is the 9th grader who never came back in September, or the 11th grader that just stopped coming. So with that list, we have it broken down geographically. Their school staff does that initial contact with that individual and or their parents. And rather than making it punitive, which has been efforts in the past that we're going to find the parents and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, we actually offer them the carrot, which is come into the worksource centers, come in and get assessed. Let's help you get back to school, and then let's also talk about this job thing. And so when the parents and the young people come in, if they're under the age of 18, at that point, if they intend to join, they sign a waiver and allows us to share data. If they're over 18, they can sign their own waiver to share the data between the city staff or our community partner staff and the school district. So getting them in the door has not been our issue. And then the word of mouth. Once you do good work, people will tell other folks, and it really comes back to us. The other thing that we did was what we call student outreach days. And at least once a year for the past 5 years, the superintendent, the mayor, city council members, school board members walk door to door and with that list of the dropouts, knocked on their individual door. And what a surprise when they opened the door and saw Mayor Garcetti standing there with his entourage saying, let's talk about you getting back to school. What we find when we do the door-to-door knocking is that it's inside that household. Not only you find that young person, but you find their brother, you find their cousin, you find their tia, you find their uncle, you find other family members who have also not graduated, and then being able to do that outreach as well.
That's fantastic.
And then on the issue of the longer term of keeping them engaged, it really is, the fundamental tool of youth developers, or youth programmers. You have to do good youth work. If the kids think that you're doing crap, they won't come back. They vote with their feet almost instantly. If you do good work, they'll continue to come back. They'll continue to be re-engaged.
Fantastic. Celine, do you want to try and pick up on what you were saying earlier?
I want to try again.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will just kind of start where I think Robert had a really great point where he was saying, that you start with really, really rich local data. And I think that for DC, just to your question, Maggie, earlier about sort of the non-academic piece, if you've got a pretty clear mission that's education focused, how do you also acknowledge and help make sure that the non-academic pieces are addressed? So in DC, as we think about what co-location and what our connection of services look like for the Re-Engagement Center, we are actually standing on local data that was actually produced through efforts of our nonprofit group through Raise DC, as well as with support with leadership by DCAYA, that gives us from a student perspective as to what were the causal factors that ended up making you make the decision that school wasn't for you, and then even if you were to think you were going to go back, what is preventing you from doing that? And so we have a really rich, from a youth perspective, what is preventing them. Couple that with some of just the national research, right? Like that's out there, but you really do need local data, and that was a really good, rich data set for us. That is instrumental. It's an instrumental tool in us thinking through what our year one co-located services look like. As Andy mentioned, one of the things that we kept seeing is that, this income piece is huge, whether it's work, whether it's affording transportation, whether it's affording daycare. So we're really starting to think about, for our first year, or not starting, what we're doing in implementation now is trying to solidify partnerships that are going to address those in the first year. So one being, we are actually physically going to start on location with our Department of Employment Services. So it's akin to Robert's agency, because that young people are going to come to the door because they want work. But when they go through this process, they're finding out what their job prospects are so minimal because they don't have a credential. So how do we make that handoff there? The second piece is in terms of income supports. We know through our data that a lot of young people who could potentially be eligible for public benefits, our welfare dollars, our SNAP dollars, our WIC dollars, aren't accessing them. Layered on top of that, how do we make sure that people who are on time are getting their work hours? So we actually are sitting down with our Department of Human Services to figure out how can we co-locate people to do eligibility identification and enrollment on site for those type of income supports. We also are looking at training up our center staff to be able to do eligibility and to provide on-site childcare vouchers for parents who see that as a barrier. So we not perfect, but we are figuring out where our starting point is. And to Robert's point, you start with local data, and that's the data set that we're using. To the question about outreach, we are following the practices that we see our colleagues in other cities using, which is like a really concerted outreach. What we've found and what National League of Cities was really helpful in helping us distill was that there's actually multiple gateways for young people to enter and get rooted back to education opportunities. But you have to be in our juvenile justice system. You have to be in our foster care system for that. There's a gap for just anybody who really didn't trip into one of those systems to be able to have a way back. And so one of the things that we're looking at is how do we get that data list from our schools? How do we tap into our statewide system that spans both our DC public schools and our charter schools to get that type of information? And then once we have that, how do we leverage some of our existing outreach? You know, we've got really strong programming from our nonprofit sector and from our agencies that are deeply creating roots in communities. How do we use them as sort of our entree into a community? So we are spreading the word that this is something that is available. So we're figuring out our starting points, but I'm truly excited, and I think there's I love sitting here, and every time I feel like I hear Robert, I'm taking notes because they're great ideas, and if they can figure it out, hopefully they can help us figure it out faster.
Yeah, Maggie, would you like to hear more on outreach? Just a quick comment on that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. So consistent with the answer I typed in earlier about the three different kinds of structures we're seeing so far around the country and re-engagement centers. I'm probably oversimplifying, but just to make these points, we're similarly seeing two or three key approaches to the outreach function. So one is that the outreach workers, are hired by the re-engagement center, work for the re-engagement center. That's the quote unquote, maybe it's hard to call something that's 8 years old classic, but it's a classic model from Boston where they famously hired two young men who had college degrees, but earlier in their educational journey had actually themselves dropped out of high school. And they had tremendous relational youth development skills and were just really fantastic. And that this role of engaging young people who were out of school and needed to get reconnected. And that staff has now expanded considerably. There's a little bit more variety in the history of the people in those functions in Boston, but that was the basis. Then I think of the deployed staffing model in Denver, Colorado, piloted by our colleagues at Colorado Youth for a Change, where they have a very large staff of youth workers, some of whom specialize in outreach to specific communities, such as homeless youth or LGBT youth. And so those workers are going out to where the young people are, and sometimes they're responding to initial inquiries that come through a text message from a bus shelter sign or an email that comes from a website connected to the Drop-In Denver campaign. And the third model I would just mention is one that I certainly recommended for strong consideration in Washington, and that's how we've seen Omaha proceed, where the decision was in Omaha not to develop all the capacity under the roof of the re-engagement center, or what they call the Direction Diploma D2 Center itself, but instead to enter into agreements with 10 or more existing high-capacity local youth serving organizations who had staff who could be, each of whom could be partially dedicated to this outreach function. They're called Youth Academic Navigators, or YANs, and they it's a poetic name, and they're also deployed, but they're based at the different youth serving organizations. So those are three of the key models we've seen, in addition to what you heard Robert describe.
Great. So I have a question from one of the viewers about how critical, this goes back to a previous point, How critical is engaging families throughout this process, and are there specific case management models that have been used that have high efficacy? And I'll toss that to Andy or Robert.
Yeah, I gave a preliminary typed answer, which is that's
Yeah.
actually not something that I've tried to document so far. I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm happy to look more into it and spread the word afterward. But Robert, is that something that you all have tried to do?
Sure, and we don't have a specific model in terms of the family engagement, but there's another aspect to this, is that the vast majority of the young people we work with, especially that 18 to 24 population, are parents themselves. Mm-hmm. So they're family units, as described, and you have to deal with it as a family. Now, the issue with them being young parents is a whole other dynamic that you just have to build into this programming and help address. And to Celine's point, being able to see what benefits and what programs they're currently eligible for is really, really key. So as we know these kids, we know that they're not adept at being good bureaucrats, and carrying around their paperwork and their eligibility documents and all this other crap that we ask them for. So they're really about being young people, and so that's the one thing that we can really do, and we try to assist, is to co-enroll them in terms of the other benefit programs that we've done. And we've had some mixed models that we've been experimenting with, but that's a real key point about, especially on the parenting side, for them. So we do make sure that they do have health care coverage. We are asking that question, and then we also are making sure on the DPSS, or the public benefits side. Secondly, on the family itself, almost all of these kids, like I said, have a story behind them. They just didn't one day stop going to school. They usually stop going to school for a reason. In Los Angeles, because we have such mixed families, is that the young ladies will stop going to school because they're babysitting, younger siblings. The young men will stop going to school because for various, reasons. What we really try to do is engage them for where they're at, and then build back that way. Because their family structure might be that they're living with a grandmother, they might be living, with an auntie or an uncle, and so it's hard to say that we have a traditional family model approach. It really is seeing what unit that they're within. Also asking the question if they are a parent with the mothers, they'll say that. With the young boys or the young men, often you have to ask 2 or 3 times, are they supporting somebody, or are they a parent? And then help them address those issues as well.
That's great. So, Celine, I'm going to toss you a question in a second, but I'm going to stick with Robert for one more minute. Looking ahead, if you could really grow and expand 1 or 2 components of the system you have now, what would those be? And I ask that because DC is looking to evolve, and you're about a year ahead.
Yeah, so 2 things. I would think it's really that connection back with the community college. And we have a great community college district right now, and we've been working, it's a 9-campus system. So we've been working campus by campus and developing the ties and relationships there. But that's an area that I would love to have more systemic involvement. One of our youth centers is actually co-located on a campus at Harbor College. And so I think we have a lot of lessons learned from that to take it out to others, especially with the ruling that kids that don't have their high school diploma are not eligible for federal financial aid, which changed the whole dynamic at the community college level. So I think that's an area that we could definitely learn and grow and evolve on. And then the second area is really what you had mentioned about the eligibility for benefits, and doing that more systemically versus location by location.
Great. And Celine, I promise I will ask you this in a second. But Andy, have you seen any strategies nationally that you wish were replicated or would recommend would be replicated and grown in every single city or community?
Well, so one of the exciting things we've been focusing on over the last 18 to 24 months is the first real enshrinement of support for re-engagement in state policy out in Washington State. And of course, you could say that the efforts so far in DC are rough equivalent of that, in the sense that DC is a state-like entity. So that means that there's funding, technical support available for the creation of re-engagement centers, often very closely tied to alternative schools across Washington State, and it just speaks to a kind of a scaling strategy that's similar to what Robert's been able to do across the LA basin. So that's a very exciting innovation. And then I would just second what Robert said, that both in Washington State and a few other places, there's including Dubuque, Iowa, there's some experimentation with linking more closely with community colleges as partners, so that the re-engagement center does not simply focus on and pat itself on the back for getting young people a high school diploma, but really tries to create a kind of a propulsion effect. And my colleagues at Jobs for the Future have come up with a good concept for what they call back on track strategies that begin with re-engagement, but continue through enriched preparation for a GED, support through the transition into community college, and then support in at least the first year of the community college experience. So that's pointing toward credentials that have the chance of landing people a family supporting job.
Fantastic. And again, we are encouraging people to type in questions if they have them, and my staff is bringing them in as they're able to. But Celine, I'd love to hear from you. Where do you see the district evolving after year one? I mean, we have a lot of momentum. There's a lot of excitement. What would your wish list be?
Oh, my goodness. So I think that, just piggybacking off of Andy's description of Jobs for the Future's Back on Track, I think that's sort of where I would love to, and I think we're poising ourselves for this. It's a chess game. We're trying to get the pieces in place. I would love to see in year one, obviously a very successful first year for the Re-Engagement Center, and I would love to be able to come out of that with our expansion plan. What does that look like? I think, as Andy and Robert said, it could look many different ways, and in terms of what the Re-Engagement Center is setting out to do, but more importantly, really clear lessons and good data for us to think about what expansion looks like and what the next iteration of this looks like. So that's just the Re-Engagement Center. There's concurrent work that's actually happening with a lot of the same players to look at the high school experience. What does our non-graduate population look like? What do we need to know about students in middle school, their transition to high school, and what our citywide dropout or non-graduate population looks like for us to begin thinking about, okay, what do we need to be doing to stop the leaking, right? So it's trying to figure that piece out. The data that's coming out of that work is showing us student profiles, student patterns, the indicators that we know are going to be most predictive of not graduating for the largest swaths of students, and where they are in the city, what schools, whether it's a traditional school, whether it's a charter school, we don't care. We're able to identify that now. Building on that and the data from the Re-Engagement Center, it's the next big piece that I think DC really does need to tackle, which is growing our second chance system. Andy has from the very beginning been really, really clear for what he's learned in other communities and where he's seen gaps in DC is that our Re-Engagement Center as the one piece is only going to be as effective as the varied landscape of options that we can give students to have good fits. What we're seeing through our data, and actually one of them, I'm going to stop for a second and go on a bit of a tangent, is our state office is really going to be managing this moving forward because they have their state longitudinal education database. We have lists of students who are most recently dropped out, but we have historical data on years of students who have been disconnected from school. And we are able to see their patterns of trying to reconnect, but without success. part of our theory is that they're just not finding a good place that's going to help give them the support they need, help them get, the environment that they want to be in that's going to support them. So all of this is us thinking, we have a piece for a re-engagement center, but we actually really need to be focusing too on making sure that we have good, viable, varied, multiple options in our second chance system. So, and that spans from both traditional schools that are funded through our per pupil funding formula, charter school, traditional school, but then also our nonprofits, and how are we leveraging our partnerships with our WIB, with our funders, about what types of programs they want to be investing in and how it aligns to help grow our sector.
Great. So on that, I'm going to turn to a question. And Celine, if you would plug in your other earbud, I think it might remove some of that.
Oh, okay.
Great. But a question that came from some of the viewers is probably targeted to Andy, but what implications will the changes to WIA, so now WIOA, have on holistic re-engagement efforts?
Yeah, I gave a quick answer here, and I know Robert's been following this very closely as a leader in youth employment activities nationwide and a member of the U.S. Conference of Mayors Workforce Development Council. But the short answer is it's extremely promising that there's more emphasis than ever on serving out-of-school youth. That's where the money is being pointed, and there's new language that I think picks up on Los Angeles' successful application for Workforce Innovation Fund money and recognition by Department of Labor and others on the Hill that it should be and now would be an allowable use of this funding to support re-engagement activities. Anything more you'd want to add on that, Robert, as you've been watching it closely?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think it's the recognition that there has to be resources put out for re-engagement. And I think as Andy has been leading this charge for the better part of the decade, much of those efforts at the local level have been come out of local hide and local dollars, and folks not really sure if they should use WIA and to what extent. We took a leap of faith by using our WIA dollars to fund the system and build the system. And the Workforce Innovation Fund grant dollars actually helped solidify that. But so it's really satisfying to be able to see it in the national legislation, because when you really think about it, what other federal resources are available for this particular population in a broad, non-programmatic scale? There's the youth build dollars, which is great. There's Job Corps, which is great. But we needed something else that is more comprehensive and broader than just a specific singular national program.
That's great. Any other sort of broad lessons learned on the systems level piece? I mean, you took a leap of faith. That's tremendous, but a little bit scary, I would imagine.
Yeah. So when I talk to folks about this and to the local leaders, and really say to the DC folks, you have a tremendous leader here, and I'm really glad to see Celine, being and having the courage to take this up. A couple of things that I always say in compliments is that the biggest detriment usually for good youth programming is adult egos, and oftentimes we prevent ourselves from actually doing good programming. So, as you come to the table, come with courage, come with conviction, and come with the egos, as I say, out the door. That you really have to do this for the betterment of your young people that you're trying to serve. So that was a huge lesson, both at a local level and also in the discussion on a national level.
And I would just add, Maggie, that again, in looking at Robert or in thinking about months to come in Washington D.C., mayoral transitions are inevitable, and yet the role of leaders in grasping an issue such as the absurd number of young people who are in this opportunity youth category, and committing city resources and the goodwill of the city to trying to solve those issues is critically important. So, smart social entrepreneurs such as Robert situated inside a city department or able to make the case to mayoral administration after mayoral administration about why they would want to direct their investments toward system building, why they would want to enter into a partnership with the Unified School District. And similarly, I know Celine and other folks in Washington will be thinking about the next generation of leadership for re-engagement and related efforts. You can't leave that part aside. You can't assume that good staff work alone will keep driving this.
It's definitely an exciting time. And again, if you guys are enjoying this conversation, we encourage you to please donate so we can continue to deliver these types of opportunities. We have another few minutes if there are any other questions. But I think you've all left us with a lot of food for thought. And Celine and I, as we continue to work through this in both RAISE and with DC government and DCAYA, we're going to have to think about some of those lessons learned and how to tie to the community college and how to keep that momentum going despite a transition. So we really do appreciate your insights and we continue to pick your brain as we evolve. Celine, Robert, Andy, any final thoughts you'd care to share?
I guess a couple final thoughts would be that it's really a team effort. Here locally, I mentioned Deborah Dorado, but on our city staff, there's a number of us that are working on it. On the LAUSD staff, a number of folks, and then across our WIB and youth council. And we really just made it a team approach and really just keep it centered about, we're talking about young people who are very vulnerable, young people who are in need of assistance, but young people that have tremendous amount of skills and tenacity, and all just need the opportunity to be able to achieve success.
Let me pick up the baton from Robert and just say, that similarly, our inclination at the National League of Cities Institute for Youth Education and Families is to develop and then support peer learning networks among city leaders around the country to promote sharing of promising and best practices, to promote inquiry about what's proving challenging or what's not working, and to get past various hurdles. So it's when I speak today, it's really with the benefit of this whole re-engagement network of 17, 18 sites behind me, and the rich body of experience that represents, and the great efforts and progress that people are making in cities large and small.
So I would just conclude by saying, this has been a really, really amazing opportunity to join Robert and Andy and the group that's on the call right now. I felt slightly awkward when you all introduced us as experts, because I feel like, okay, I looked at Andy and I looked at Robert as experts, and we're certainly learning so much here in DC as we sort of build and fly the plane at the same time. Even though we're still in the nascent stages, I would say that, of course, like any good student, we're learning even now, and I can't underscore enough the coalition building work that Robert was talking about. It is so a team effort, and part of it is really being very strategic about how you position this re-engagement work as being mutually beneficial for all the partners that are there. Your workforce partner, this is a piece that they own, even if they don't see the direct, the direct link. Human services, it's all of it is really just trying to make sure that you are building a team, because this is one, the work is hard enough, and everyone's got to have a really clear lane, and they have to be working in concert. And then to Andy's point, you have to build it so that it's protected against political changes. You have to put the mechanisms in place, and you have to wrap it with really big champions. So we're just, it's a slow start for us, but I think a lot of it has been, the nuts and bolts of it, but really it's been trying to make sure that we're getting as many people to understand how important this is and be willing to, because that they feel compelled to make sure that they're offering up their resources and their connections and their support. So I think that has definitely been a big learning curve for us for the last, few years, because it's so simple to take a feasibility and say, here's what you have to do. Step 1, step 2, step 3, and it really doesn't work that way at all. So,
Well, thank you all again for making time to be here with us today. We really do appreciate it. You know, it's an exciting time to be in this kind of work, and I think the sentiment that these are true opportunity youth, and it's our duty to invest in them and support them to find success is a strong message, and one we have to continue shouting from the rooftops, as we said, particularly during times of transition. We do hope that you enjoyed the conversation. Please feel free to continue to put in questions or send them to our email, and we'll do our best to answer them in tomorrow's blog, which will touch on a lot of the messages and takeaways we've had here today. So please do check that out. It's DCAYAblogspot.com. And, you know, be sure to check out our website, dc-aya.org, and to follow us on Twitter and to like us on Facebook, so you can continue to get updates and opportunities to engage in these kinds of peer learning sessions and learn from, you know, somebody on the West Coast what they're doing. It's a great opportunity. We really appreciated everyone's time, and thank you all again.
Well, thank you for inviting.
Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.